Don?
We're ready.
Okay, so we can go ahead and get this started then. Collecting Apistogramma species in South America. Probably narrow it down a little bit more than that. I'd probably say collecting Apistogramma species in the upper Orinoco of Venezuela would probably be a little closer, but this certainly applies. You want to move on? Next slide. Okay, this is the state of Amazonas that I live in here in the bottom part. This is all one big state right here, and it's called Amazonas. And it's about 25% of the total land mass of Venezuela. So all of what I was doing is going to be in this upper part right in here. So you come down the Orinoco, and then the Orinoco, this is Colombia here, Colombia. Then the Orinoco cuts back in, separates into what is the Rio Ventuari right here, and then this is the uppermost part of the Orinoco River, and then it begins as a series of waterfalls right here in a very remote area, very close to the border with Brazil. This is going to be Brazil down here, and this is the Rio Negro River right along here. This is the Rio Negro, and most of them, like I said, most of my work has been in this area right in here. So that's mostly what I'm going to be talking about, are the species that came from there. Although the heading for this is Apistogramma McMasteri complex, I can probably use this map to point out where all the complexes are. First, let me point out that there's a number of different species complexes we're going to be talking about. The McMasteri complex is one that Kuhlander, who's a ichthyologist who's worked out a good part of the systematics on Apistogramma, says is the most regular grouping of Apistogrammas. They're all very closely related. They all have what's called a monophyletic relationship, which means they have one common ancestor. Another complex we're going to be talking about is the broadband complex, which hasn't really been described as a complex yet. In fact, the broadband hasn't even been described as a proper species yet. But there's apparently several closely related species, and I found a new one myself, and there's apparently other ones that occur in the Rio Negro that are very similar. Actually, I found two new ones in that complex, and we'll discuss those later on. And then there's the Pratensis complex, which is mostly based in the Rio Negro and Amazon rivers and their systems, but we have a number of species that have spread up through the Orinoco. One reason why the Orinoco River is so important in Apistogramma, when studying Apistogrammas, is it used to be the major drainage for what was called Lago Amazonas. The entire Amazon basin used to be a giant lake, largest lake, freshwater lake the world's ever seen, and the tectonic activity that created the Andes Mountains, which is very recent geologically, created the Amazon River, which may only be a few tens of thousands of years old, and drained the lake down through the what is now the Amazon River into the Atlantic. Before that, it all drained through the Orinoco River into the Caribbean, and the Orinoco was approximately 5 times larger than it is now. So that's how a lot of these species, or at least their ancestors, initially got spread through this giant lake, and the Orinoco draining it. Sometime, probably during the last ice age, the tectonic activity that created the Amazon did start draining the lake, and this coincided at a time during glaciation, world glaciation, and sea levels were approximately 300 feet lower than they are now. So the Orinoco may have actually even quit running in places, become intermittent. That allowed species to be able to evolve independently that may have had a common ancestor, and that's where these complexes come from. We're talking about only a period of a few tens of thousands of years, so the species are, of course, going to be very closely related.
Apologies.
Can we go to the next slide? This is the first fish we're going to look at. It's really a beautiful fish. It was Donald was the one that managed to convert this photograph over And beautiful fish. This is a hongsloi. Comes from one of the tributaries of the Cataniapo River. And hongsloi is a fairly recent species, and it's the one that you find most regularly along the Orinoco River itself. A lot of the drainage of the Orinoco, the tributaries, you have hongsloi, especially in the lower courses. And it occurs in a wide variety of habitats. Now this one you'll notice is primarily a black and white species, or population. There's some red-colored facial markings, and on the caudal peduncle, at the base of the tail, you'll see some red markings. But in other populations of hongsloi, you'll find that where the black in the stomach is replaced by red, and the white is to a very large degree replaced by yellow. There's a reason for that, and it is evolution occurring in front of, so to speak. What's going on is that this black and white morph is coming from water that's fairly clear. And black and white can be seen from a long distance, so it's better for the males to display and attract females from a long distance. The population that has a high degree of red and yellow comes from water that's very, very murky. Visibility is very low, and so you don't go for high contrast, but rather you go for red and yellow, because those are two colors that show up best in murky conditions. And in populations where the water is murky, the males tend to have a lot higher component of red and yellow. Go to the next slide. This is one of those populations here. This is a fairly young specimen, and you can see right along the anal fin, the base of the anal fin, there's some red markings. You'll also see a few black markings in the flanks there. You'll see that on the caudal peduncle, there's primarily a red spot. Now this is a juvenile fish, and it's a first generation. It comes from the location of the parents for this. It came from a place called Provincial, which really is very murky, very muddy water. The red in the stomach, as this fish matures and gets closer to reproductive period, the red will become a lot more intense in the stomach, and there'll be a lot more of it. Also, the red spot on the caudal peduncle will probably turn just solid red. The body will develop a lot more yellow. This is just a young male that hasn't really developed yet. Next slide. Here's another specimen that comes from an area called Alto Carinagua. And there they tend to go more towards the black, but occasionally you'll find a red one. A lot of them are neutral like this, not really showing either one, either the red stomach or the black stomach. So there's a lot of populations. Next slide. And here's a closely related fish that's also in the McMaster Eye complex. This one's called, I just call Cataniapo. And it occurs in tributaries of the Cataniapo River, but in areas above where hongsloi occur. If you remember the first slide I showed you, I said was a hongsloi. Not more than about 3 or 4 miles further up from there, you find this species, which is in the same complex but very, very different fish. Next slide. This is the Cataniapo River. It's fast moving. As you can see, it's pretty clear and it's cold, and it's fed by mountains. And this effectively serves as a barrier to keep the fish from moving. So you can have one tributary a couple of miles away from another tributary and have a totally different species, and they don't mix. You never find one in the habitat of the other. Very, very interesting. So what I theorize is this, is that, like I said, hongsloi is found primarily along the Orinoco, the main channel, and all the tributaries. I think that's fairly recently derived species and is in the process of really expanding its distribution. This one I call Cataniapo is what we call a relic species, which was probably a leftover from periods when the Orinoco was much larger and just managed to survive in these small lagoons. Next slide. This is where the black and white morph comes from. This is in a place called La Reforma, which is on the road to a place called Gavilan. And this is a very popular spot with the Wahivo Indians, the Cuiva Wahivo, who live in the area. They come there and wash clothes a lot. And in the foreground there on the right, you'll see there's a lot of algal mats. And that's probably caused from the laundry, soap laundry that they use now. In the stream, in the upper right-hand section and off to the left where it bends, there's a kabamba found there, which is growing about 4 feet long and is bright red in like the last 6 or 8 inches. Just bright, bright red, really pretty stuff. Below the bottom left corner, there's a type of grass. The stream narrows a bit, and there's a type of grass which looks a whole lot like hair grass to me, the giant hair grass. And it's folded over, and a lot of the hongsloi I collect there in that hair grass, and I also collect it in the leaf litter, which you can see along the periphery. There's a lot of leaf litter on the left side of the stream. There's a lot of leaf litter which gets heavier than that a little further downstream, and I do find Apistogramma species broadband there. So the hongsloi and the broadband are found together. But one thing I want you to note for future photos is look at the clarity of the water. It's really, really clear. Next slide. Here we go. This is the lagoons at Provincial. Provincial, like I said, is where the hongsloi, what they call, the Germans call the red stroke hongsloi with the red stomach, comes from here. And you'll see that it's used by cattle. And these lagoons flood annually and essentially merge with the Orinoco River. So there is a lot of genetic material moving back and forth through these lagoons. Some years I'll go there and collect, and I'll find things I've never seen there before, and I'll go back again and they'll be gone. So different things colonize it and use it in different ways. Maybe I haven't got it all figured out yet. The only aquatic plant in this location is the water hyacinth. Next slide. Here we go. There's a close-up of the water hyacinth, and you can see the turbidity, the murkiness of the water. Although I really like collecting this lagoon, it always fascinates me, and I did recently find a new Apistogramma species there. You come out of the water and you have leeches stuck to you, and there's electric eels in there, and there's big anacondas, and it's kind of annoying to bump into something big under the water that moves out of the way. You don't know what it is. And electric eels let you know what they are, and they really zap you hard. That's perfect habitat for an electric eel. The Apistogrammas here, like I said, I find the red stomach hongsloi in here. Also, there's a new Apistogramma that I found that's in the Pertensis complex. A whole lot like four stripes, but very orangey yellow color, with a high sail fin, dorsal fin, and long bright orange ventral fins. And unfortunately, because of policy changes by Continental Airlines, we don't have pictures or specimens of that right now. The Apistogrammas that I collect here, I have a couple of methods. One thing I do is I will come up underneath the water hyacinth with a net, and I'll pick up the water hyacinth and I'll just shake the hell out of it. And then the apistos fall out of it. Also, a lot of blue rams collected in that habitat. Rams tend to like really hot water. They prefer water above 100 degrees.
Oh boy.
Yeah, the very hottest place you can find it, that's where you find the rams.
Mixing that with my fish.
Yep. Seriously, it's so hot that it almost burns being in the water. Other fish I catch here, a huge number of doradid catfish, unbelievable variety of gymnotids, the knife fishes. I've never caught any cory cats in here at all. Number of other cichlids that you collect in here. This is the only place I've personally collected, I think it's called, what is it, Hoplarcus psittacus? Is that the right name, Carolyn? For the true parrot cichlid?
Yeah.
The true parrot cichlid, which gets to be a big green red-eyed monster. I've caught those in there. Fascinating hole of water. Next slide. Now this is, contrast this to the Cataniapa River, that fast-flowing river I showed you earlier, and that stream where the black and white morph of hongsloi comes from. This is the lagoon where that species Cataniapo comes from. Very, very different looking habitat. No true aquatic vegetation, but you'll notice all the reed-like plants along the sides that are submersed. The apistos that occur here, I've only found them in these two lagoons, one here and one a little bit further up the road. I have to sneak in and collect the fish because the Indians there don't like anybody poking around. So, and I've tried paying them before, and that doesn't work because they show up with 5,000 dead fish and expect to be paid. So you can't use the Indians. So I just basically hire a taxi. He drops me off. I jump in there, catch my fish. He turns around, I get back in, and we leave. That's how I collect the fish there. An interesting thing is the bottom of this, you can't see it by this picture, but it's covered with this slimy orange, bright orange mold. It tends to grow on everything. And from what I understand, it has to do with all of the oxidized iron that's in the water. And there's bacteria that feeds on it. So when you walk around, it's kind of a yellow clay-like substrate, and the water gets murky really fast. There's only about 4 species of fish found here, which is very rare for anywhere in the Amazon. I've only found about 4 fish there. There's a splash tetra, equidens, what's close to mete, which is another cichlid, and Acaronia voltuosa, and that's all I've ever found in this lagoon. Next slide. This is a picture of a wild-caught Apistogramma species broadband. And although the fish is pretty stressed out and he doesn't have his fins splayed, it's not that great of a photograph. Look at the banding in the tail and notice the color pattern on the anal fin. See, the anal fin has a black trim, and then there's a red, blue, and then a yellow margin and the anal fin. Also, the suborbital stripe is very, very broad. Next slide. Here's a female Apistogramma species broadband and reproductive pattern. This is a wild fish that I brought back, and this one comes from a population called Pottawania. Next slide. These are offspring, F1s of the broadbands. Next slide. And there's the father, also came from the same population as the female. Again, notice the tail pattern on the caudal fin. See, the banded pattern is much reduced than the male I showed you earlier. And the anal fin pattern and markings are a bit different. What it is there's, again, they've colonized different tributaries of the Orinoco, and they've already began evolving, into their own particular niches. Next slide. Here's a different fish, which is in that what I call broadband complex. And Donald took some remarkable pictures under difficult conditions, and this is one of them. It's not that great of a picture, but one of the things you can really see clearly is the double lateral spot. Apistogramma species broadband normally only shows one lateral spot, whereas this one, which I call Apisto species San Antonio, has between 2 and all the way up to 5 lateral spots. Notice the caudal pattern on the tail. It still has that banded pattern, but if you look at the anal fin, notice how banded the anal fin looks, how many bands there are. Next slide. Here's a little bit clearer picture. Again, you can see, although the lateral stripe is pretty heavily produced in the mood of this fish, you can still clearly see there's 2 lateral spots. Another thing is if you look underneath the chin, you'll see that black goatee. That's a common feature you find in almost all of the members of the broadband complex. Next slide. Couple of fairly young of the population from San Antonio. One thing I'll point out on these specimens, look how yellow they are. Tremendous amount of yellow. Next slide. Here's another species, San Antonio. And very, very clear, the 2 lateral spots. Next slide. A lot of times when you're collecting, you're using 4-wheel drive vehicle, and a lot of your collecting sites may be accessible at least during certain times of the year by road. You spend a lot of time driving or hiking through this stuff. Next slide. And a lot of times you end up in a place like this. This is at Potawatomi. This is the particular habitat where those the breeding pair of Apistogramma broadbands and all the juveniles. This is the exact location where I collected them. So this is their habitat. You'll notice this is at a period where the water is still relatively high. You'll see all the grasses that are bent over, and although it's hard to make out, the bottom is completely covered with leaf litter on a very murky substrate. Next slide. Here's another picture of the same habitat. There's a plant which has kind of a three-pronged star-like, you can see it there in the foreground. That was a very common plant. It's only underwater part of the year. I'd say probably about 4 months of the year would this be submerged. Later on in the dry season, you can see the main channel right on the other side of the grasses there. The water immediately drops off about 4 feet from right there. And in the dry season, it'll fall down to somewhere below the edge of that grass. Other fish I collected here, I collected a huge number of Apistogramma species, 4 stripes, and broadbands. And in previous collecting trips at this location, I'd collected one called white seam, which we'll take a look at later, which is a very interesting fish, the Pratensis complex. Another fish a lot of you are probably familiar with would be Dicrossus filamentosa, the checkerboard cichlid. Catch those here in pretty good numbers. Next slide. Here's a boy, Pierrot, Indian boy. His brother was spearfishing along the place called Pozo Azul, where I go to collect fish periodically, and they had a nice little stringer of fish that they collected up that morning, and he was nice enough to let me take his picture. And a lot of fish there people might recognize. There's actually 2 different species of peacock bass. You'll notice right here there's one which is Cichla orinocensis, and there's another one here called timonensis. So 2 different species of Cichla, which were both collected in that same locality, same habitat. There's also some Procolotus there, and there's a Leperinus maculatus right here. You can see the spots. Next slide. Here's Apistogramma species 4 stripes. It's named because of the 4 stripes you can see in the abdominal region of the fish. Because the angle of the fish, it's real hard to see the 4th stripe, but it's there. Stripes in the abdomen are a very common feature in all the members of the Pratensis complex. Other features on this fish, I'll have you note, this is an adult male that was breeding during this time period. It's a little stressed out because of the method we used for taking the pictures, but it was a reproductive male. But note the ventral fins are relatively short. There's also relatively broad bands in the caudal fin and the tail, and there's a large but fairly indistinct caudal spot, caudal blotch. Also somewhat of a checkerboard pattern, which you see in juvenile specimens, and also in adults in their fright pattern. Next slide. And that's a real common habitat right there. That's a little pool right on the side of the Pozo Azul, and the boy that was holding the stringer. And that's a site right there where 1 scoop of even a small aquarium net, and you could catch literally a dozen or 2 dozen Apistogramma species 4 stripes. As an interesting side, a predator of the Apistos there that I collected was Pipa pipa, which is the Suriname toad. It's an aquatic frog that looks like a pancake, and they were in there eating the little cichlids and tetras. Next slide. During the rainy season, the water level goes up significantly. Later on in the dry season, the water level will go down, and the edge of the leaf litter there will probably still be up on the dry bank, and the sandy area right on the other side of that will provide habitat for different types of fish. But right now, that leaf litter has a lot of the Apistogrammas are in there during this high water period. You'll never find Apistogrammas in intermittent water. They'll move up the side of the banks and back down again seasonally, utilizing the different habitat, and apparently they reproduce year-round, which is, experiments have shown that different pHs, hardnesses, and temperatures can affect sex ratios. So if you have a species that's breeding year-round in a dynamic habitat, and sex can be determined by different environmental factors, this may cut down on the incidence of sibling matings because your males and females are maturing at different rates, and they tend not to breed with each other so much. Apistogrammas live in little microhabitats, so they don't move around much. So they have to have a method of populations being able to protect what genetic material they have. Like I said, apistos are evolving at an incredible rate as we speak. And so maintaining, their genetic diversity will be important in the future for the different populations. Next slide. Here's a nice fish, female, nice healthy looking female. This is a really rare one called Apistogramma ineridii. It comes from a location across from the Orinoco River, but in Colombia, called Puerto Inírida. And used to see these fish on the market fairly often as wild fish, and a lot of fish used to come out of that part of Colombia. And FARC is now in control of things down there and doesn't allow the collecting of ornamental fish. So that's why a lot of Colombian species like blue-eyed plecos don't show up. There's plenty of them there. It's just nobody's brave enough to get in there and collect them because FARC doesn't permit it. Next slide. Here's a male with a dangler. There's another male up on the top that you'll see as, see the series of blotches below the very broad lateral stripe there? That's very typical of this species. This is in the Pratensis complex. If sufficiently different from any of the other species, it's definitely a valid species. But you'll probably notice that with all the members of the Pratensis complex, they have a lot of similarities. The same body shape, the same facial structure, short ventral fins. You'll see the ventral fins are very short. Banded caudal fin, the tail's banded, and a somewhat indistinct caudal spot, blotch on the caudal peduncle. Next slide. Here's another member of the Pratensis complex, a couple of male Apistogramma apezis. These come from, this may not actually be one species, but a case of where there's two species that are, have evolved sufficiently enough to where they don't crossbreed with each other, but they're so similar that the scientific community is unwilling to separate them as species. There's a population that comes from the Orinoco River in Venezuela along the upper Orinoco, and then there's a population in the Rio Negro. The only connection between the Rio Negro now and the Orinoco River is this little short river called the Cassiquari, which is really nothing more than a natural canal that connects the Orinoco with the Rio Negro. And the upper Orinoco River loses about a third of its flow down the Cassiquari River. So there's not a whole lot of movement on these genetically, so there may actually be two species that are so closely related they're hard to separate visually. Next slide. Just a little bit more of their battling going on. You can see the red spots in the throat of the male there. This is the one that they used to call the blood throat, sailfin apisto. It's a very common name. Next slide. Just more pictures. You can see the female there. She's interested in what's going on between these guys. Interestingly enough, even though this is in Pratensis complex, you'll notice it still has that tall sailfin-like dorsal fin, short ventral fins, and a somewhat banded caudal fin. But the caudal fin is different because you'll notice that it does have the points on the upper and lower tines there. It is produced not quite a lyre-shaped tail, but definitely, bilobally pointed. Next slide. There's a female that's ready for reproduction. She's colored up for reproduction. Next slide. And I got a lot of slides of these guys. That's just a nice picture of the male showing the red spots in the throat. The Dicrossus filamentosa could actually be, you can find sympatrically with this fish. Same habitat. Next slide. Okay, just more of the same. Next slide. Okay, here's one I told you about earlier called the white seam Apistogramma. This fish is probably had been in captivity for over a year and is an adult fish. There's almost no sexual dimorphism between the males and the females on this species. They look almost identical. It is in the Pratensis complex. You see it still has all the same features of most of the other members of the Pratensis. One of the problems with this fish, because of its small adult size, a lot of times when you collect Apistogrammas in a particular habitat, you're mostly collecting juvenile specimens. And you get a bunch of these, or a few of these, mixed in with a collection of other species that are juvenile, and they're just impossible to sort out. It takes months and months before the others grow up enough to realize that, hey, this is something else. And so a lot of times in collections, these are completely missed. A lot of them that are exported, maybe, which is very rarely, people think, oh, that's just a runt fish, it's not developing, there's something wrong with it, as happens sometimes with fish. But it's a valid species. Like I said, there's hardly any sexual dimorphism at all. The males and females look virtually identical. This may be a deeper water, more of a lurking type species. Notice how large the eye is in comparison to the body. So this one may come from blacker water and also habitat that maybe is a little deeper underneath wood, that sort of thing. Next slide. And here's another typical Apistogramma habitat right here. Looks like something you'd step in and go halfway up your sneakers, and they'll absolutely be loaded full of Apistogrammas.
How
So,
deep is that?
I'm sorry?
How deep is that?
That there is probably about maybe 4 inches deep.
Okay.
And it's absolutely full. A lot of times people, when they're out trying to catch fish, they'll go out to wade out to deep water, and yeah, it's okay depending on, you know, if you're catching fish that like that. But for Apistos, your best bet is to pick through this. Is that it? I think that's okay. Well, that's the presentation that I have for you today. I'll be happy to answer any questions.